Hello, everyone. We'll just give a few minutes as people come in, but thank you all for joining. It is, really excellent to be bringing people together for this timely discussion amidst uh, quite fraught circumstances in Myanmar and globally. I would just maybe hand over to Stella to explain the Burmese interpretation that is available.
ဟုတ်ကဲ့အခုကျမတို့တက်ရောက်လာတော့ဧည့်သည်များပေါ့နော်ဒီမြန်မာလို direct ဘာသာပြန်တဲ့ဟာကိုနားထောင်ဖို့အတွက် direct translation အတွက်ကိုကျမတို့ဒီအောက်ဆုံးမှာလေနော်ဒီဟိုဟာရဲ့ဒီ Zoom ရဲ့အောက်ဆုံးမှာဒီကဘာပုံစံလေးကဘာလုံးပုံစံလေး globe နော်အဲ့ဒါ interpretation ဆိုတဲ့ဟာလေးတွေ့လိမ့်မယ်အဲ့ဒီပေါ်မှာနှိပ်လိုက်ရင်ဟိုဟာ English နဲ့ French ဆိုပြီးတွေ့တယ် French ကကျမတို့မြန်မာလို direct ဘာသာပြန်တဲ့ဟာကိုနားထောင်ခြင်းတဲ့သူတွေအတွက်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်လို့ French language ကမြန်မာဘာသာစကား direct ဘာသာပြန်တဲ့ဟာကိုနားထောင်ဖို့အတွက်ဖြစ်ပါတယ်
Stella. All right, let's get the ball rolling. I'm not going to speak for too long, but just do a little bit of scene setting and introduce the panel. So we have Adelina Kamal, who is the co-founder and steering committee member of the Southeast Asian Women Peace Mediators. She was also the former director of the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance, also known as the AHA Center, and Adelina has had long-term engagement with Myanmar. We have Manny Mong, who is a research associate with Humanitarian Policy Group, which is part of ODI Global. Manny also has a long history working in journalism and human rights issues. We also have Stella Noor, who's joining us and is a Kachin human rights activist and also written a lot about Myanmar affairs, human rights issues, and is currently also a doctoral researcher. It is an absolute delight to have all three of you on this panel to have what is a fairly impromptu discussion, but I think very timely considering what is happening in Myanmar and also globally. What is happening now is part of a much longer arc of difficulties in the country and globally. So I'm just going to set the scene briefly before we jump into the discussion. So obviously there's a lot of attention to Myanmar at the moment and owing to the earthquake, and HPG really wanted to kind of bring together a few different voices to kind of inform some of the aid sector engagement and international political engagement in the country. What we are seeing now is kind of nearing a potential culmination of a long arc of military junta rule and atrocities, but also resistance against this. Even before the coup, there was nearly 19 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, which is only further escalated following the earthquake, and an estimated 3 million people internally displaced, plus potentially millions more as refugees across the borders. Now, I know there's a lot of contested views around Myanmar and look forward to hearing the panelists. I will just use a few quotes from Chris Sidoti, who was part of the UN fact-finding mission, and he has been quite a prominent voice around the need to stop treating the military as a legitimate government and critiquing the UN as prioritizing presence over effectiveness. There's also been claims that the UN response in Myanmar has been woefully inadequate, and this doesn't go back to just post-coup, but also, a long-standing dynamic where this narrative of development will bring peace has not been particularly effective, particularly if we look not just at the coup, but the genocide that unfolded and long-standing atrocities against ethnic minorities and indigenous groups and other minority groups across much of the borderlands of the country. This is all occurring against a backdrop of nearly 50% of aid cuts across the humanitarian and development sectors, and as of this week, also 44% tariff on Myanmar exports into the US, further crippling an already challenging economic situation. So without further ado, I want to hand over to the excellent panelists we have, and we'll start with Manny. There's a lot of, various information in the media, a lot of word of mouth, but we'd really love to hear from you because you're very well connected with what's going on. If you could really outline what's currently happening in Myanmar and some of the most pressing issues. Obviously, we are the humanitarian policy group, but you also bring in excellent human rights perspectives, journalism background. So it'd be good to hear how these also relate to the humanitarian dynamics. Thank you, Manny.
Thank you, Dustin, and thanks everyone for joining us today at such last minute. But I think that it's fair to say that this is a really urgent discussion that we should have. And I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but there's certainly a drastic reduction in the amount of coverage that we've seen in the international media even since last week. I've even noticed just this morning, having a look around on social media platforms, that the algorithms have shifted because, we have these tariff wars ongoing now. We don't have enough international coverage from inside the country, let alone local coverage. And I do want to discuss those issues. Forgive me if I'm going to repeat anything that people know, but I think it's really worth contextualizing the issues again, and I'll try and be really, really quick. We have very little visibility from on the ground, and we're relying heavily on citizen journalists. We're relying heavily on the victims, the survivors themselves, people who've been heavily traumatized by this catastrophe, and subsequently 4 years of coup and the aftermath of that. It's really unfair that they're shouldering this burden, but it seems that when you look at these images and when you hear from people on the ground, we talk about humanitarian aid and first responders. Sure, we have some countries that are now arrived and on the ground, but in everything that I'm noticing, it's Myanmar people, Myanmar volunteers, very localized first responders, many of them who are survivors themselves and also now shouldering like triple burden. It's an unfair situation that Myanmar has been put into, obviously, notwithstanding the aid cuts. And I think the humanitarian sector really needs to have a good look at themselves right now, because this is a humanitarian failure. This is a failure of the international response, and it has been compounded by years of allowing Myanmar and its military impunity, allowing it to get away with a litany of human rights violations. And what we're seeing now is, again, a systematic continuation of these violations. So we have evidence of airstrikes immediately after the aftermath of the earthquake. We have humanitarian aid blocks. We have prevention of aid that's already there from reaching people in need. We have had international responders turned around. I mean, it's shocking that we had French rescue and search teams in the country ready to go, only to have delays by an incompetent military that were delaying, and then sent them around the very next day after announcing that, oh no, they're not going to conduct search and rescue operations anymore, so therefore they don't need international help. We actually, I'm going to pick on the Australians here because I am de facto Australian, so I feel like I can do this. But I just saw an excellent post about DFAT getting into the country and how they have also got their first responders there. I mean, what's first responders a week after the incident? There is a great deal of need, but it's not first response anymore. People are dead, and that's the actual fact. But also complimenting Myanmar on its recent commitments to temporary partial ceasefires. What is the partial ceasefire? There's no such thing. There's just no ceasefire, and that needs to be acknowledged as well. I don't want to go into the numbers. I think people can access UN OCHA briefs, but ultimately, I do want to say we have these airstrikes. We have reporters who can't go in. International journalists are now forbidden. We have temporary blocks, apparently temporary. Let's see how long that lasts for, on tourist visas, and no-go zones even for locals and people who are on the ground in really, really affected areas. So these are ultimately rights violations. These are ultimately international humanitarian law violations. And if we look at it as a consequence of each other, I do think there's an argument that we could make that this is collective punishment, because mainly in these areas, people who are in need have also had strong resistance and they haven't been allowed to access necessary aid. Right now, the pressing need is clean water, food, sanitation, housing, and really, really serious concerns that there are already cholera outbreaks. So with that, I know I've taken up 5 minutes, but huge need. And I think, Stella, it would be great to hear from you about, what's happening within the localized response.
Excellent. Thanks, Manny. Stella, yeah, it'd be great to jump over to you. I'm just struck by a lot of the conversations now kind of replicate what happened after Nagas, and there's kind of a lot of ongoing and very conflicting discourse. And Roger McGinty refers to this idea of recentism, where we detach current events from their historical embeddedness. So I was wondering if you could speak a bit more of like contextualizing the current context within this deeper political contested historical picture, particularly around, you've worked a lot on Indigenous self-determination, sovereignty, and other aspects. It'd be good to flesh out that picture. Thanks, Stella.
Thank you. Thank you to ODI, Dustin, for this platform. And Manny perfectly laid out the ground for me to take us into this important point. Let me remind us that in 2008, in the Nargis, which was the most devastating, a natural disaster that killed almost 100,000 people in Burma or in Myanmar. And so, but also at the same time, what's happening, the behavior and response or a lack of response of the military is not unique what's happening right now, because in 2008, when the Nargis struck on like May 2nd, a week later on May 10th of 2008, the military went ahead and organized this referendum, constitutional referendum, and that led us to adoption of this 2008 constitution, and many of us call this the Nargis constitution. And the fact that they pushed ahead with the referendum in the face of this worst natural disaster in the history of our country show the military has always been focusing on protecting their own power, not about the people, but it's about their own power. And the whole post-2010 in transition was based on that Nargis constitution. The constitution solidified the military's formal power and their role in national politics. And a decade later, fast forward to 2021, that very constitution was used to justify the 2021 attempted military coup. And since 2011 political transition, international aid, and before the 2021 military coup, as soon as there was so-called, the transition happened, international aid and diplomatic efforts and strategy focus, they focus on allocating most of the resources and support to the central government in Naypyidaw and their, the central authorities partner. This led to the decrease in funding allocation for, border-based and local civil society and community-based organization. And so recently, since 2022, at least the UN Secretary General kept calling for this immediate return to democracy. Well, that may be well-intentioned. I have so much problem with that, because the election that took place between 2010 and 2020, like within that decade, right, that took place under the Nargis constitution, did very little to improve the lives of many marginalized community. Sure, it provided, some limited space for change to some spaces and to some community, but it was in fact worse for so many like already marginalized ethnic and indigenous community, including the Rohingya people. And so fighting intensified in 2011 in my own community in the north, in Kachin, and that displaced tens of thousands of people. So many ERO or ethnic rights organization or indigenous rights organization, right? They were pressured to sign nationwide ceasefire agreement in 2015 that provided very little clear roadmap on how that was going to lead to peace. And so up until between 2015 to 2021, there was no substantial outcome of the nationwide ceasefire agreement. Now that post-2021, after the attempted military coup, we're seeing the emergence of local governance structure in many parts of the country. And there are two reasons why this is unavoidable, right? This was going to happen because one reason is for many indigenous community or ethnic communities who lived as sovereign people before the independence of 1948, alternative governance has become the only way for people where they can achieve their right to self-determination to decide their own future in the face of state oppression. For decades, for generations, and number two, they developed structures of self-sufficiency because they had lost trust in the central authorities willingness and ability to provide life-saving and basic essential services to people living along the border. And so I will stop there and we'll continue my discussion for the next phase. Thank you.
Thanks, Stella, for putting in that broader kind of contextual piece, which I think is really important as we think about how should the international community be engaging now. There's also issues of, okay, the immediate, as Manny has pointed out, the immediate life-saving moment is now past, sadly. So what do we do in this early recovery? And there's already reports, I've heard multiple reports of the military blocking lots of access, but also trying to channel support to Napier Door, to military-controlled areas to reinforce their kind of supporters there. I'm going to hand over to Adelina, because it'd be great to kind of zoom out to some of the broader humanitarian system and architecture, including in the region, and getting some of your analysis on these kind of broader dynamics as well. Thanks, Adelina.
Thank you very much, Dustin, the HPG, for inviting me and to speak together with other esteemed panelists, Manny and Stella. First of all, my deepest condolence to the people of Myanmar. It's unimaginable tragedy. I'd like to mention what you just said, Dustin, earlier about the so-called McGuinness concept of resentism. And it's basically connected to what I have said in one of my LinkedIn posts, the so-called catastrophe of militarized neglect. And that frustration, that I still have until now, that was resulted from reading updates, disaster updates, social media updates, initial assessment, right, from the responders, many of them with good intent. But it looks to me that they're either intentionally ignorant or they're naive that the earthquake happened in the midst of war, right? That they're ignorant with the context of the disaster. You call it perhaps resentism. I find it quite difficult. Narrowly focus on the current event, basically the earthquake, and forgetting what happened in the past and forgetting, all the other things going on for decades. I will call it simply intentional amnesia. First and foremost, and why I said that. First and foremost, the earthquake happened on top of conflict, like other colleagues have said, on top of conflict and multiple sufferings of the Myanmar people. Myanmar is again at war. It was a devastating earthquake happening in the middle of an active armed conflict that creates layered emergencies. But before the earthquake, long before the earthquake, Myanmar was already the most vulnerable country in the region. Even AHA Center Risk Monitor report said so. And the UNDP said that nearly half of Myanmar population was already living below the poverty line. So we're talking about vulnerability, the lowest vulnerable population in the region. And the earthquake has intensified this polycrisis, pushing the so-called resilience, is really actually a negative resilience of the Myanmar people to the brink. So that's first point. Second point, the earthquake was seen by geologists, the disaster responder, as both completely expected, because it is actually acknowledged that the location Sagang fault, right? Sagang fault. We have heard earthquake happening in Sagang before. AHA Center's response, the first response of AHA Center was also Sagang earthquake. So it is both completely expected in terms of location, Sagang fault, but also completely unexpected. So it's just a matter of time. It will happen. It should not be considered as a surprise. It is known that it would happen. It's a highly active fault already with a long history of major seismic events. So the science was clear. It's the timing that was unknown, but the risk was certain. So it was a predicted disaster waiting to happen, but knowing the risk without doing it, without an action is meaningless, and knowledge without action is useless. Third, the coup 4 years ago, the failed coup 4 years ago, especially, and decades of political turbulence disrupted the so-called disaster governance. Okay, why I said that there's no such thing as natural disasters, but because disaster happen, when you are very vulnerable, and then you are not calculating the risk. Public institution, engineering standards, and urban planning were already weakened or repurposed. The investment that's supposed to go for disaster governance or disaster preparedness or risk reduction diverted into prepping your military or bombing the civilians. Ongoing conflict diverted attention and resources away. The young people of Myanmar got conscripted. We have less doctors because they got killed, or they have to join the revolution. Communities already displaced by conflict and now face further trauma and risks. So people's ability to prepare was already constrained not only by the economic hardship, but also insecurity and fear. So it's like double jeopardy and double misery. So it's not again a natural disaster. And there is no such a thing as natural disaster. The disaster management community has said so many times. This is a catastrophe of militarized neglect that could have been prevented. And only when you remove the cancer, that is the military dictatorship, then only then you can build proper disaster governance. I'll stop at that.
Thanks, Adelina. Yeah, I think you hit a few nails on the head there with the militarized neglect, intentional amnesia, and obviously this very clear issue of removing the cancer. On that note, I think it'd be interesting to kind of broaden it out, the discussion. And a lot of us are here today in, humanitarian policy group, ODI Global. We try to inform better aid practices, convene space. There's a lot of political dynamics going on as well. The tension between contested governance, human rights, resistance, and humanitarian response. The tensions are very acute in Myanmar and humanitarians often struggle to grapple with this complexity. So I wanted to throw it out. Maybe we can start with Manny and then go through the same order again, but feel free to jump in. But what are your kind of overarching or key recommendations for aid sector broadly, humanitarian actors, political actors, in how they engage in Myanmar? We're past the life-saving moment. What now for the recovery and longer-term political solutions? Thanks, Manny.
Thanks, Dustin, and thanks, Adelina. You just spoke truth, and I love your passion about our country, because this is something that is infuriating. You know, you're asking me, Dustin, like, what do people do now? Why does this question even need to be asked? There are already systems in place in what to do if there is a humanitarian crisis, yet none of those practices have been able to be meted out. So why do we keep negotiating with the military as if it's a legitimate partner, a trusted ally? None of this is the case. They have proven time and time again that they are unreliable, that they lie, that they purposely target civilians and commit war crimes. I don't understand why international aid actors still think that they can negotiate with them. Right now, there is a massive trust deficit. And Stella also mentioned this, you know, localized action has been, of course, the most successful because they're there, they're on the ground. There has been an established system or network of support that's been conducted over the many, many years of oppression and violations taking place. And I think right now, what the humanitarian sector can do best is to support those networks. So looking at mutual aid systems and looking at ways in which to directly funnel any type of aid and cash assistance to the people on the ground who are delivering those services. Because people don't trust the UN. People don't trust international aid actors because they've seen that they are too willing to talk to the military. There's also a fear that anything that's given to the military will remain with the military. And that's also a fear that has been deduced from years of experience, right? People have been actively denied the aid that's been given to the military. And now the military has said that they will take over the relief efforts. So I think there's a massive trust deficit that needs to be bridged here.
Thanks, Manny. I'll hand over to Stella. And just for the audience, beware that we will allow plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So your thoughts, Stella. Thanks.
Sure. So this argument of, right, like, oh, we have to work with the state to get to, you know, into the country. It's the formal, you know, the state actor. But this UN and international organization who continue to cite state as the reason for why they have to go through, you know, these areas where it has prevented them from saving lives and providing life-saving essential services. I will say it's a lazy, out of touch, and dangerous narrative. And a friend of mine, a humanitarian worker from Chin State, said, this slowness or a lack of adjustment and adaptability of international organization and UN have been extremely painful to see, because if they were more flexible with their support and response, they could be helping us so much more effectively, and we would be saving so many more lives. And let me also quote Adelina's the report that Adelina co-wrote with, if I believe with Progressive Voice. Adelina said, junta access obsession. Even if INGOs, humanitarians, and UN organization, even if their stated objective is to save life, but that obsession is preventing them from reaching their own stated goal. So wake up. And also this state-centric, state as the only formal and legitimate actors to work with, that out of touch statement many existing research, and also ODI has its own brief that at least more than 200 million people in the world live outside of formally recognized state-controlled areas. And particularly in the global south, where humanitarian services are most needed. And so for many indigenous and ethnic people in the country, they have been left on their own. And UN and INGO said, well, you know, the military don't want them, they don't want us, they don't trust us. Well, what about the people in the country from many marginalized community? They actually want you to work with them, work for them, but then you don't think that's important. And so there is there's very confusion going on that people can understand. And as many mentioned, that is the reason why people don't trust UN, because their obsession to work through Naypyidaw and Yangon, even in, as my colleagues previously highlighted, that in Sagaing, one of the most affected area at the moment, aids are not reaching them. People are relying on neighbors and local humanitarian aids. And it has been through NUG, it has been through informally organized local, humanitarian chapters. And so there are resources, how limited they may be, but people want you to work with them. And so work with people who want to work with you, not with the regime. And also, I will just say this, as one point, a Karenni volunteer teacher at the IDP camp that I recently spoke to when I visited them, they are teaching their school classroom in a bomb shelter. And then the teacher said, I want our kids to find power through our Karenni language-based education, learn about our history. And I tell these to the kids that we're so much more than the food and humanitarian assistance that we're receiving right now. Let's make this time and moment to build our society so that we never have to run from the war again. And so the reality, though, at the same time, that was empowering and that was hopeful, but also at the same time, the reality, also the teacher said, kids who they seem weaker this year in their learning, they can't focus because of the reduction of food rations, and also the military continue to commit airstrike. And also in the every evening and every morning before the sunrise, there are drone monitors over the IDP camps in the situation where kids are already learning their classroom in bomb shelters. And so, as my colleagues mentioned that, I'm going to wrap this up with this thought that this is not the first time that we're having this conversation about, come on, wake up, work through local civil society organization and people who want to serve the people and are serving the people. How much more do we have to talk about this conversation? It's been going on for too long. It was such a waste of time and energy when we have so much work to do. Do your job and work with people who are doing the work, not the military who is attacking and killing people. And if you believe that they're the one who are going to save, then you better not work in Burma. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks, Stella. Yeah, very, very insightful and powerful messages. I think also in this context of pre-earthquake that, approximately 75–80% of the country was already under resistance control or contested. And so access to all these areas was already heavily restricted. From the research we've done at Humanitarian Policy Group, it was very clear local actors by far and away able to navigate all these different dynamics, cross conflict lines and everything, so delivering the bulk of the response. Yet so much attention gets focused on international actors that are predominantly stuck in Yangon. I'm going to throw over to Adelina for your kind of recommendations to the political and aid apparatus and its engagement with Myanmar, but also there's questions already flowing in from the audience, which is excellent. So maybe kind of weave one in, and I think it's already been spoken to a little bit, is what is the credible operational alternative to negotiating with the military? Or in other words, how do you suggest agencies who are currently responding to the disaster remain operational while also denouncing the military? So just keep that in the back of your mind as well, Adelina, as you're answering, and we'll get to some other questions. But thanks, Adelina.
Thank you. I'm going to actually build on what Stella and many have said earlier about obsession to access. I think the external responders, the international community, have the wrongly defined access. It's really coming from the international lens perspective, right? And that access is defined as going into the country from either Yangon Airport or Naypyidaw, either the sea airport, and so on and so forth. Well, if you define access as, ways to reach to the very people that you want to help, that will basically change the way you think, right? Because this is where what Stella has mentioned, work with the existing structures, the local community structures, those who the community already trusts. So that's one aspect on access. Now, on the second point, I have been in a debate with many humanitarians out there saying that, Adelina, by encouraging the search and rescue teams not coming through the junta, that is basically preventing them from saving lives. Okay, so that's really like the debate, and it's really difficult, as if that you have to choose, right? But why do the Myanmar people have to choose? You really have to figure it out. I think it's not only that that international community, that the humanitarians, the international humanitarians are experiencing amnesia, but I think there is another word, but I forgot about it. It's not only that they're lazy, it's not only amnesia of what happened in the past, but also lack of imagination and creativity. I respect there are many, rescuers who come to the country, the search and rescue teams who got trained, right? Who got trained, including Indonesians, including those countries from the region. They come with good intent, and they're good people, right? With a good intention. But now I think they have left. Many of them have left, right? Because that's the golden window has passed. But this is the reason when you have the so-called the privilege of access, this is the more reason that you need to push beyond the boundaries to save lives in the SAC as well as in the resistant control areas. The more you need to push either through quiet diplomacy or to call it out where you can, and not welcome the military junta ceasefire statements. How can you actually trust those ceasefire statements while they're still bombing? And please do not welcome the ceasefire statements. Okay, so I think again, going back to the issue of access, I salute those who not only negotiated. So I think that they could be people who negotiated and spoke up about aid obstruction. I know some of them did that and the difficulties they face. But I think many others got muted under the rubric of neutrality and only concerned with the access that they could obtain. So what started as a good intent or solidarity becomes complicity. And there are like blurred lines between neutrality, solidarity, and complicity. So again, going back to this amnesia thing, and also the ability for us to reimagine and not repeat the past mistakes. Perhaps we can redefine, right? How how access should be done. How we can redefine how aid monitoring in the context of war should be done. Perhaps, those who have the privilege of access should do their own monitoring openly and transparently and report any atrocities and obstruction. And it is not only your responsibility to the people that you want to save, but also the protection that you should and you can offer to your own staff and the rescuers and the aid workers. And this is perhaps the time for the relief and the rights people to talk to one another, the rights and the people in the recovery and development to talk to one another and reimagine creatively and don't get lazy, get to work. Now, I'm not connecting from Jakarta. I'm connecting from Doha, where I participated in the conference organized by the Center for Humanitarian Leadership and the Doha Center for Humanitarian Studies. And one of the participants here said that Adelina, because I asked him, right, Adelina, basically what the international community has done is sentencing the Myanmar people with death penalty. They're just waiting for the penalty to happen in the open war prison, waiting for their time. But what the externals have done, basically prolonging the waiting time in the open air prison. While you could have actually addressed the issue of death sentence or save them altogether from the firing squad. It's basically what your colleague Dustin has said, Zainab, that it's like helping orphans while ignoring or even feeding the very source of the problem that made those children being orphaned in the first place. Now, we have lost over 3,000 people, close to 4,000 after the earthquake, and could be more. But after the coup, we have lost over 6,000, right? Not including the number of casualties before the coup, not including the number of casualties because of the genocide, because of the death in open water, and atrocities against the minorities. So what happened to those numbers? Why are we only concerned with those numbers, over the 3,000 number, the earthquake, because of the show, that, I respect all the search and rescue teams' efforts. I respect that, but this is, I think, the time for us to be creative. And Dustin, I cannot rely on the traditional humanitarians anymore. We need to actually ask those perhaps that don't consider them as the usual humanitarians to think more creatively.
Excellent. Thanks, Adelina. Excellent contributions, as always. I think this issue around access is particularly interesting in the way it's framed, as you pointed out, because in Myanmar, a lot of markets still function. Money can move around the country. People have been quite creative in getting money moving. So the idea of access is often talking about the access of international organizations or international people. So it can be kind of a distraction from the more significant issues at hand. And this divergence between humanitarian and human rights is something that HPG is exploring quite a bit. And it's always a bit baffling of how amongst donors, amongst a lot of different organizations, how the parts of the house don't speak to each other. It's like, we're over here, and there's very little kind of bringing it together. So I think you raised some really valid points there and something we want to continue exploring. We have a question. I'm just going to kind of go into the Q&A organically, let's say. But there's a kind of more operational question, which I think is interesting, and saying, how would you, or can you talk about localized humanitarian action and avoiding divergence to non-state armed groups? And what does that mean for mutual aid actors? I think there's maybe a caveat here as well of the framing of local armed groups, because they're also, as you talked about, ethnic resistance organizations, which are not local armed groups, but are long-standing governance service state providers across much of the country that have been delivering services for decades. So I think we need to be cautious in how we frame these highly heterogeneous, diverse group of armed actors. But if you could talk, Stella and Manny, about some of these concerns or how to mitigate, issues or problems around aid diversion towards different groups. Thanks.
Stella, I'll go first just so that I can leave you more room to talk about. But I think, again, herein lies the issue about that identification of the non-state actor, right? Non-state armed group. I think it's a point that needs to be made, that at this point in time, some of these non-state armed groups are our legitimate partners. They have the will of the people, they have supported the people, they are delivering services to the people, and we cannot be bogged down by this, conventional ideation of what it means to work with a non-state armed group, because it's not the same context in Myanmar. When I was a journalist and I had to cross over from, an area that we're allowed to move in freely to what was considered a black zone or a brown zone, I wasn't afraid of non-state armed actors. I was afraid of the military arresting me, or worse. As soon as I was within an ethnic armed group area, a territory where there was a non-state armed actor present and having an area of governance that they oversaw, I felt safe. And this is how people in Myanmar feel. So the representatives here as state actor, and you've heard this before, the terrorist military, they are the ones that people fear. They are the ones that people don't want us legitimizing, yet governments keep recognizing them and acting in complicity. We have decades of evidence to show how ethnic armed groups can actually be legitimate in their models of governance. They've proven that they are trusted allies when it comes to aid. And now we're working with a much more disparate, varied, multi-actor society that we need to take into account. But again, it's this thing about being creative and stepping outside of the comfort zone. I understand there are laws that bind money, transactions, international transfers. I understand that there are mandates and principles to humanitarian aid, but this doesn't mean that local actors don't have the same principles. And it's something that we discuss at the Humanitarian Policy Group a lot in detail, about how to trust localized actors more and stop being paternalistic, because ultimately they know and they have the deep knowledge of where this aid needs to go and how it should be delivered. But this issue of, if we give money to local actors, they're not going to be neutral. Hell, of course they're not going to be neutral. It's their own people who they're trying to help survive, and themselves. But we need to stop doing this power over structure that decides where we think the money should go to.
Thanks, Manny. Stella, I feel you have lots to add on this.
Such poignant discussions from Manny and Adelina. I am in a great company. So yeah, let me follow up on that too, like to expand that, right, about accountability within these local, community, indigenous ethnic community. One example again, a Chin human rights organizations, they started off as like documentation human rights group to document human rights violations committed by the military in their in their hometowns and in their territories. But then they said that forced them to start doing delivering humanitarian aid, because when I'm asking or interviewing someone who had just fled or whose house was just bombed by the military, I cannot just ask them, okay, tell me how many times you got shot, or how many. If they're hungry, I have to feed them. If they're injured, I have to treat them or give them medicine. And so that somehow we didn't plan to be a humanitarian, assistance organization, but we became that too. That intertwined nature of, people taking care of each other. And so if we're going to measure, with the Western standard of this accountability, where everything is so rigid and everything is compartmentalized, but in people working, many community in Myanmar working, taking care of each other, have that communal, right, responsibility to take care of each other. And that is about transparency. That is about they are held accountable by people in their community. Their reputation, how they have treated each other, is the biggest resume for them to continue working the work they have to do. And so we have to step away from, what was created in this very clear state lines in the, this Western, like Eurocentric, right, culture and practices, and open our eyes and speak to people and be willing to listen and understand, okay, they may not be using the same language and terminology, but they are also doing exactly about, this system of accountability and responsibility and transparency. And so that means right, like this, the way humanitarian aid funding operate is required that allow you to identify structural processes undermining state criminality in Myanmar and recognize indigenous and ethnic governance and their way of working. And because these like accountability and communal, looking after each other is the foundation of their existence, and also that Karenni government has recently adopted, right, like the art, they call it art, the principle of accountability, responsibility, and transparency as the foundation for building their society. That principle is applied in humanitarian efforts and, service delivery in everything they do. And also, again, if we look at also the Kachin example, that, Kachin KIO, Kachin Independence Organization, have worked with civil society organization, Kachin Civil Society, CSO, Kachin CBO, to deliver services to reach people and, this displaced population who have not received, any direct or efficient assistance from INGO and UN since 2016, when the military blocked any, direct humanitarian assistance to these areas controlled by the Kachin Independence Organization. And so I think that, as many also mentioned, that for decades, people have, whether international community are willing to see it or not, it's being up to us and up to it. It's being on our shoulder to carry, this each other's burden, right, for our existence. Because when our survival is political, how can we be neutral? When someone is trying to kill us, then it was up to us to survive and do everything to support each other. And so to this just really wrap up, right? That heterogeneous, this needs, like how do you support them? How do you support them? Kachin, for example, is right, existing, locating right next to China and India, but much more so our, the settlement is near the Chinese border. So we have different ways of working. That can be figured out by listening to Kachin Civil Society organization who has been working for at least 3-4 decades to take care of each other. And Karenni, being right next to Thailand, refugee and IDP camps, they have different needs. For example, Kachin said, we prefer to take cash transfer because we cannot deliver, right? Like, material like this humanitarian assistance directly into the area. So cash is important and we can buy, the merchandise, food and medicine from nearby. Where else for Karenni, they do not, prefer cash because it's easier for them just to receive the item and, for the assistant. And so these are the kind of ways of doing things. They've been through this for a long time, as we've, talked about this entire panel. And then if we're, as international organization and UN agency, if we're with just an ounce of respect for their knowledge, right, working knowledge and institutional memory, we can do a lot of work, and it doesn't have to be through Yangon or Naypyidaw. So I'm just going to stop there.
Thanks, Stella. I think there's been an important comment as well in the sideline is also the issue or concerns around outsourcing all the work to local actors without necessary security and safety, and how that also puts a lot of local actors at risk. And I think there's a dynamic where they are often operating in the most high-risk areas, and this is a common misconception that, oh, local actors are less reliable, despite them having to work in the most acutely difficult places. So I think that was a very good comment of needing to work in solidarity, not subcontracting with local actors. There's one question here which I'll go to, but then we'll maybe kind of get towards a wrap up. And I think this has been answered in some ways. So maybe we can weave this into some final comments and maybe start with Adelina. But there's a question here about what is left for us now in a practical manner for saving lives and recovery. I'd say maybe emphasizing particularly the recovery aspect. Various emergency funds are activated, countries are committing millions of dollars. So what are kind of the next steps? Your key kind of takeaway there as we go from life-saving moment to that kind of early recovery phase. Thanks, Adelina.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. I have been also restless, thinking about the recovery, because when we talk about the recovery stage in a normal situation, not in conflict, we're normally talking about billions of US dollars. And that would require heavy machineries, that would require, strength in terms of loans, and so on and so forth, and, the big actors and all that. But I'm really afraid, right, that whatever offers are going to be made into rebuilding Myanmar, the area affected by the earthquake, will be used as kind of like peace dividends or incentive to push the so-called opposition or resistance movement to rush the peace negotiation. I have started hearing about, oh, perhaps after the earthquake, it is time, perhaps we talk about peace and reconciliation. Have you not learned about what happened in the past with the defunct nations ceasefire agreement and the failures and the the broken promises offered to the minorities through the so-called peace dividend, only to have whatever peace towns being destroyed? So this is what I am really afraid of, is that the recovery stage going to be used to basically push the Myanmar people into another cycle of peace negotiation. And again, amnesia, forgetting what happened in the past. So I guess, okay, there have been like some messages coming in, and I get a bit distracted. Sorry for that, Dustin. I think it is really important for whoever planning for the recovery stage, you should talk to those who have experience, being experiencing the past peace failures, right? And then learning from them. You talk to the ethnic groups who have actually entered into the agreement and then only found themselves violated, right? For the promises they have offered. Learn from that and then you will know. And not to rush into doing recovery as if that it is not war. I will just stop at that. I don't have. It's just like I'm lost with words, Dustin, because I think the answer is there. Only when you want to listen and only when we want to learn from the past mistakes.
Thanks, Adelina. Well said. Manny, maybe I'll throw it to you for some last concluding thoughts, and then we'll go to Stella. Thanks.
Thanks. We have some disgruntled comments, which I'm really happy to see, because the whole point of this conversation is that we want everyone who works in the humanitarian space to be uncomfortable and discomforted, much like we are. There's a lot that the humanitarian space needs to address, and one of that is complicity in Myanmar. We're focused on Myanmar here. And we understand that there's a lot of people with good faith going in, doing things that they feel passionate about, with a view to respect people's rights. But ultimately, the point is that after 4 years of coup and after 4 years of failed humanitarian action, how much is that damaging the status quo? How much is that compounding the negative impacts for people in Myanmar when we continue to work in a way that suggests that other parties are also on board? They are not. We now have a massive failure in the humanitarian sector because of the reliance on aid from the US. This indefinite, this just, we don't know the consequences of that long term, but we do know that the parameters have vastly changed, and we need to adapt quickly, because ultimately that means people die, people are dead, and we have no other backup plan. So herein lies these uncomfortable questions. And, thank you for all your help and thank you for your care. But if you feel uncomfortable working with local partners, don't do it. If you feel uncomfortable working in Myanmar, don't do it. And I'm not being combative here. I'm just saying that there needs to be a point where humanitarians ask themselves and challenge themselves these really difficult questions, because there is a disconnect, and sometimes it does mean that it implicates themselves in acts that do violate human rights, ultimately.
Dustin, can I say something just quickly?
Certainly.
I don't care people are angry being called lazy by Stella. Because I think it is, wherever you are sitting with privilege. Your feeling, your feeling is nothing compared to what the people of Myanmar have gone through. I'm just responding to one of the comments.
Thanks, Adelina. No, very succinct and important. I will respond to some of that content later as well. But first, Stella, some concluding thoughts would be wonderful.
Sure. Drawing from my own lived experience, as well as, other communities back home in Myanmar, I think for INGOs and UN agency, humanitarian organization, I think the point of your accountability should become the people you serve, the people you promise that, you will deliver those life-saving assistance. You have said it for a long time, but you haven't proven it to us. So you have failed your own words. And let's look at this, after being angry for a whole session, let's look at this, right? This recovery process in Myanmar as the window of opportunity. And let's pay attention to the way we engage and, the process, not just what we do, but how are we doing it? Let's, pay attention to the way what state actor means for Kachins, for Karens, for Karenni people growing up in our life. KIO was my government. For the Karen people, so many Karen friends, KNU, the Karen National Union, was their government. And so who are you to say that, no, Naypyidaw is your government? But you are talking about the people who have killed and tortured us for generations. And so it's time that, INGOs and UN agencies start engaging with the governments that we consider are looking after us, our well-being, and who have provided us with the services and, allowed us to speak our own language and practice our own culture and practice our religion as a Christian minority in a Buddhist country, or for Muslim minority, religious minority in a Buddhist country. And so that the only way to do it is to work with these, now like emerging new governance structures and system in many places, which have the best opportunity and percentage to reflect that diversity. Because in the Kachins or in Karenni example, when I spoke to these governance actor from the KNPP, the Karenni or the Kachins, they understand that they have to look at the diversity and take them into account in making governance decision, because we live through, right, that being punished for being different, being punished for not, being a Buddhist or not being this and that. And so many of these indigenous and ethnic government actors are paying attention to these grievances based on our own experience, and they understand. The last thing I would say is that in order to build a peaceful and plural and inclusive society, they have committed to and have proven it that that they have to work with civil society organization. And so for many women organization, for the first time, they're getting to be part of this, governments in, making decision affecting their life, rather than just, as activists on the sideline, which is great because I'm an activist. But also we need people who are going to pay attention to do those diversity and differences, and, people who are small, like minority groups. And that's exactly what these indigenous and ethnic governance actors are doing. And that's if that doesn't convince you, I have nothing more, and thank you.
Thanks, Stella. Thanks, Adelina. Thanks, Manny. I'd just like to say, from the humanitarian policy group perspective, obviously we welcome having all three of you, and we also make a concerted effort to foreground voices that are less heard, particularly within the humanitarian sector, that we see as, and this goes on to the question from Will, there is a lot of discussion around the humanitarian reset, creating a more simplified and efficient system. There's a lot of global discussions going on behind very closed doors, and a lot of voices and inputs, particularly from local and national actors, are being excluded from this huge moments of reform or change, or maybe staying the same within the humanitarian sector. And the Humanitarian Policy Group makes an active decision to bring together different voices, different perspectives. We want to engage and encourage dialogue between rights actors, between humanitarian actors, and so we really welcome all the contributions today. In reference to the question around the humanitarian reset, in my eyes, and I think this would be the same for the panelists, a lot of the questions here, and this relates to a question that's just popped up, is the relevance of what's going on in Myanmar is acutely relevant to what's happening in Gaza in terms of violence against population and atrocities and lack of respect for humanitarians, contested governance, as we've seen in northeast Syria, previously northwest as well, and other contexts. So there's a humanitarian system geared around very short-term interventions, yet over 90% of crises are now protracted. Contested governance is an acute dynamic within Myanmar, and the resistance holds far more legitimacy and far more territory than the military. So we have this focus and preoccupation on the military, yet the long-term solution or direction for Myanmar is around the resistance being supported to get rid of the military control in the country and hold the military to account. So the more that humanitarian actors can align with this direction, which is not my direction, it's what the popular will of the Myanmar population is pushing for, the more we can get behind that as international actors, as humanitarian actors, political aid engagement, the better. And this goes for a lot of other contexts as well. So being able to navigate, as we say in Australia, being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We can work on humanitarian response. We can also address the key drivers of crisis. But thank you all for your active engagement online. There is a form to fill out for feedback, which we really encourage everybody to provide feedback. Also, we are a think tank and we're not particularly fast on doing these kind of responsive things. So this was an effort to try and be a bit responsive to the earthquake and put together something quite quickly. So I hope it's been a useful session for people, and encourage outreach, whether to humanitarian policy group, to the panelists. We all kind of welcome engagement and really want to see a more improved and enhanced humanitarian engagement in Myanmar. Also recognizing, and I think this goes for some donors, for some international actors, often the best practices are absolutely hidden in Myanmar. So again, there are a lot of excellent practices that just don't get any daylight because of the various sensitivities as well. So we do acknowledge that. But I just want to send a huge thank you to our panelists, Adelina, Manny, Stella. You were wonderful and gave us lots of food for thought. And thank you to the communications and AV team at ODI and HPG, who done an excellent job on very short notice. And thanks to everybody who's joined us online. We welcome ongoing engagement. Please read the various content we're putting out, and feel free to reach out anytime. We'll leave it there and have a good evening, afternoon, morning to everybody. Thanks so much.